Thank you. Perhaps I should preface my remarks by also saying thank you particularly to Gary Banks, whose invitation led me to be here. It's a great pleasure to be invited to be a part of this conference for the first time in my case. Perhaps you'd also mention, you would see from the chair in public finance at Wellington, Victoria University of Wellington, it's perhaps not obvious that I come from an economics background. So what I'm going to give you today is an economic perspective on the growth challenge. Economists are often accused of using equations when numbers would do better, and using numbers when words would do better. I'm going to use a mixture of all three today, but I promise you at most you'll get two equations, and I hope they'll be fairly straightforward to understand. I suppose the first question, okay, this bit the technology is working, that's good. The first question really would be, what is the key growth challenge I'm going to talk about? And the key growth challenge I'm going to talk about is fiscal policy. Now, someone who has a chair in public finance might not be surprising that I picked fiscal policy as the topic. But of all the areas you could think of that are likely to be challenging to achieve, to improve growth and to achieve more inclusive growth, which will be things such as Ross has talked about, and indeed the ministers talked about earlier about achieving faster multi-factor productivity growth or labour productivity growth. I think fiscal policy is going to be one of the important, not the only one, but one of the important areas that will help us to achieve better growth outcomes and better inequality outcomes if it's used correctly. But if it's used incorrectly, I shall argue that it could have some quite serious damaging effects. And why is it important? Well, you can see on the screen why I think it's important. Clearly, the government is a big player. It's 30 to 40% of the economy, so if it did nothing to the rest of the economy, just by itself, what government does is going to be quite important. But we know, whether you listen and believe the left-leaning politician or the right-leaning politician who would argue that government is either bad for the economic performance or more government is good for economic performance, the one thing they don't typically argue is that it's irrelevant for economic performance. And so I think what politicians do is likely to be important in that fiscal space, what they do with taxes and public expenditure. And we also know that some policies are likely to be growth-enhancing and might be bad for inequality, whereas other policies might not have such a difficult trade-off. Indeed, they might be self-reinforcing and enhancing of both aspects of policy. But what I will be arguing is that I think current fiscal policy in many OECD countries is unsustainable, and therefore that's why it's a challenge to do something about it for the coming decades of the 21st century. So in essence, what I'm going to conclude from all of this is that future fiscal policy choices will essentially be more difficult than we've been used to in the past. And if we don't tackle these more difficult choices, it will have serious consequences for economic performance, whether that's measured in terms of inclusiveness or growth outcomes, GDP or whatever. So here's what I'm going to argue over the next 20 minutes or so. And it is that many OECD governments, I think, have been overspending. And what I've used the phrase overreaching themselves, excessive spending in the sense that it's unfunded and has been unfundable. I shall be arguing that it's not just a GFC problem. The GFC has brought it into clear focus, but many of these problems have been sitting on the government's books, as it were, long before the GFC hit us. And what the GFC has done is A, highlight it, B, worsen it, and C, make it imperative that we do something to fix that long-term problem. So what I'm going to do for the next maybe 5 or 10 minutes is quickly work through some evidence to help to persuade you why I think there is a serious problem that has been building over much of the post-1950s, post-1960s period, and what the consequences of that have been. So first off, I guess 2 points I'd make would be the first one you can see on the screen there, and that is that public expenditures have risen substantially relative to GDP. And most of what I'm going to be talking about when I talk about taxes or spending will be relative to GDP or some equivalent measure of the size of the economy. And they've risen without comparable rises in revenues. That's had two main components. It's been what economists would call real resources. It's been health, education, administration, those things that involve taking resources from the private sector and putting them in the public sector. But it's also involved substantial growth in what economists typically just label as transfers, namely when the government essentially doesn't use resources, it simply takes resources from one part of the economy and gives it to the other. So pensions and unemployment benefits, social welfare payments, and so on, we would class as transfers. Of course, there are some resources involved in administering them, but when we increase our social security benefits, essentially it's about taking taxes and redistributing it to other people. So the second area that we've seen is since the 1950s, and which essentially is reflected in fiscal deficits, and that is that quite legitimately governments have decided they want to incur deficits during downturns, but what's tended not to happen is that in the process of recovery, of boom times or more normal economic times, they've tended not to reverse those deficits and turn them into surpluses. And so as a consequence, what you see in the data is a series of episodes of what you might call persistent deficits over long periods of time. And that is associated with sustained rises in the ratio of debt, public debt to GDP. And this is all before the global financial crisis hits. But the other point you notice, as I'll show you some data in a minute, is that it's very different across countries. It doesn't, I would argue, imply that some countries don't need to worry about the problem and others do. Different debt ratios in different countries might have quite different implications than if. So a low debt ratio in New Zealand, for example, doesn't mean that it has no problems just because it's maybe a third of the debt size of some other OECD countries. So quickly to show you some data to help back that up, these are data that I've taken either from the IMF or the OECD, and they generally cover the main OECD countries, or they cover the whole set of 30-plus OECD countries. So this first chart is looking at different types of government spending and how it has changed over about a 30-year period. And you'll see, I guess the key takeaway from this chart is that government consumption spending, so that would be the normal wages and salaries for public servants, for health, for education, defense, and so on, is a pretty substantial component, together with social benefits. So in terms of where's the growth been over the last 30 years, it's actually been pretty uniformly across those countries, and they're not atypical, I think, of a wider group. It's been in government spending more on doing things, and it's been government spending more on transfers across the economy. If there's been contraction, it's tended to be in areas where governments previously subsidized. And in many countries, interestingly, after listening to Joe Hockey and Bill English, government investment doesn't look to have been a positive contributor to growth in many countries. Indeed, you can see the pink bars are quite often negative for a number of countries. But then the other thing you can do is home in on the consumption side of public expenditure that we've just seen has grown quite substantially. Now, this chart from the IMF covers a much longer period, 1960 to 2011, so more like 50 years. And you can see that government consumption spending is something like 15% higher in places like Denmark and Iceland than it was at the start of the period, dropping down to countries like the USA and Britain, where it's more like 5% or less in the case of the USA. But what the chart does is to emphasize the two main components that's contributed to the growth of public expenditure, the so-called volume effect and the price effect. Now, the relative price effect essentially just picks up the fact that if productivity grows more slowly in the public sector over a sustained period of time, which it typically does in terms of the data at least, then effectively it gets more expensive over time to produce government stuff than it does compared to producing private sector stuff. So we may not be producing more public services, we're just spending more in order to produce the same public services. And what this shows very clearly is that the price effect has contributed very substantially to much of the growth of public expenditure over this quite extended period of time, 50 or 60 years. The volume effect, yes, some countries have increased, as it were, the real amount of government activity that they're producing, but in many cases that appears actually to have been negative. The price effect has been so dominant. And then here's some evidence on deficits and debt that gets to really what I would say is the heart of the fiscal policy problem. So in this case, the OECD data comparable across countries doesn't go back so far, so I've only gone back to 1996. But what this shows you is that the budget balance, the balance between taxes and public expenditure in green bars, has been negative from the mid-90s, around minus 3% or so, right through to this quite dramatic impact of the global financial crisis and the subsequent recession. The blue line is the structural deficit, which really is just the same as the actual balance, but it takes out some cyclical aspects and takes out some one-off expenditures. So whichever way you look at it, these fiscal deficits have been pretty exactly that, uniformly deficits that governments have been incurring. And if you went back before the 90s, you tend to get the same sort of evidence. It's just that there are fewer data points for the countries involved. And then you get what I think is one of the most interesting charts that the OECD has recently produced. And apologies that these data are not all kind of consistent with one another. I've had to pick and choose data from the various sources I could get it. But the reason I think this is interesting is that this helps to put the growth in public debt that has been the consequence of all these deficits into a historical perspective. And the really interesting thing is that you look at what's happening now compared to the previous peak. This was the peak at the end of World War II that everybody knew about. Governments incurred huge public debt in order to fund the war. That was itself a consequence of persistent rises in history as a result of the First World War, then during the recession of the 1920s and 30s. Then we've got this rise in the Second World War. Governments recovered considerably until the late 1960s or mid-1960s, and then you've got this general tendency to rise again, where, apart from this case in the 70s, where inflation effectively eroded much public debt, increases in public debt have not been, during difficult times, have not been followed by decreases in good times. And so we've had this general upward trend. And my point about the pre-GFC problem being the more significant one is, here's where we were sitting before we even got to the GFC. A pretty high level on average, about 80% of GDP was the level of public debt. And the GFC has simply pushed that right up to something like the peak of wartime. Now that is a significant, I was going to say achievement. I don't mean to imply it's a positive thing. Many people were very, very concerned after the Second World War about the level of public debt. Now, as it happened, and it may not have been coincidental, substantial growth over the early post-war period and substantial inflation during the 1970s helped to bring some of these debt levels down. It's not impossible the same thing could happen from the current position. But we certainly have to challenge ourselves as to what are the consequences of having this level of public debt, and will we be capable of getting it down? What policies do we need to pursue in order to achieve that outcome? Just a quick follow-up on the GFC itself. So the GFC in public finance terms had two quite significant effects. One is this, as you've just seen in the previous slide, a quite significant increase in public debt purely as a result of the fallout from the financial crisis. The key number here is probably this average across the OECD. So the ratio of gross debt to GDP rose from about 73% to about 111%. So for a short period of time of 6 or 7 years, that's a huge rapid rise, as I say, you saw on the previous slide. And it's reflected in the gross value, the financial value of debt, which is what you've got in these numbers there. And then the second aspect has been that both the level of public debt we know before the global financial crisis was very different across countries, but the change as a consequence of the global financial crisis was also very significant. So you can see Australia and New Zealand down here, along with fundamentally a group of Scandinavian and East European countries that started off, this is 2000, so well in advance of the global financial crisis, relatively low levels of public debt, anywhere around 20 to 40%. And then you've got some of the really big ones up here. Japan, of course, has had a very high public debt for a long time. But you've got the countries that even in 2000 turned out to be the big European fiscal problems: Greece, Italy, Iceland for slightly different reasons, Portugal, Ireland, and so on. And the OECD average saw a jump from around about 70% of GDP in 2000 to something more like, 95, 96%, possibly more than that, by 2010. And some of that has, in fact, increased since 2010. So, but very different performances. So some of these countries, the blue dots match quite closely with the bars. Other countries, very big jumps as a result of the global financial crisis. So I guess the question that you're probably asking is, so what? There's the data. Yes, debt is big, but why is it a problem? The reason I'm going to suggest it's a problem is that governments have got to abide by two relationships, and here's where my equations are going to come in. And these two relationships that I will argue over the long run, in fact, it doesn't need me to argue it, mathematics tells us over the long run, governments can't avoid, and that is the government budget constraint, and the second one is what we're generally referred to as the debt dynamics equation. So the government budget constraint is actually very simple. It simply tells us what you can see there, that spending has got to be funded by revenue or by borrowing, But we also, any spending we want to do of what you might think of as a useful kind, spending on roads or social transfers or whatever, has also got to, our revenue has also got to fund any debt repayments that we make. So the interest rate times the amount of outstanding debt that we have in any particular year. So if we're in a world in which, as many countries seem to be now, where it's going to be very difficult for governments to fund their budget by borrowing more, to achieve budget balance, it's pretty obvious that taxation has got to be equal to the sum of the spending we might want to do, as it were, plus the spending that we're committed to do to repay our debt. And that implies that basically that surplus has got to be equal to the amount of debt repayment that we're committed to. So as it happens, what we saw in that graph of budget balances for the 1990s was that most budget balances were typically of the order of -2 to -8%. In other words, deficits of 2 to 8%. But if you're going to have budget balance, you're going to have a balance that's something equivalent to the amount of interest that governments are committed to pay. I mean, this is a bit like you and I paying our mortgage. That goes out first, and then what's left gets spent on other things. So governments are committed, unless they're going to put themselves in real financial difficulties by defaulting on their debt, they're committed to paying 2 or 3%. In some of these European countries, 5% of GDP is payable on interest payments on past debt. So clearly there's a disconnect here. It's not possible to balance the budget if we go on incurring deficits of 2 to 8%. We're going to have, just to keep the balance constant, and that's not repaying debt down, that's keeping the balance constant, we're going to have a primary balance of around plus 2 or 3%. So then there's the debt dynamics equation, which is putting that same kind of information into the long run. We don't need to go into the detail of this, but an important equation in this context is, again, to think of a world in which we're going to try and just keep the debt ratio constant, not let it rise anymore. The primary balance, it can be shown, is roughly equal to the difference between the interest rate, that's the R that's payable on your debt, minus the growth rate, times the level of initial debt. So, again, put some numbers on that. If I had time today, I'd go through some data that shows you, if you look at the average interest rate on government debt over a long period of time, certainly on long-run government debt, and GDP growth rates, that number is typically positive. In other words, interest rates are typically bigger than growth rates, of the order of 1 to 2%, sometimes considerably bigger than that, sometimes less than that. So with these kind of numbers, if you're going to have a sustainable primary balance, namely one that doesn't lead to worsening debt, take these numbers and put them together. And so what you get is, imagine you've got this 1% differential, and you've got a 50% initial debt. You're going to have a primary balance of plus 0.5%. If things are a bit worse, if that differential is more like 2%, and 80% is more like the debt levels that many countries went into the GFC with, 80%, that's going to give you a primary balance of about 1.6%. So that's what you've got to aim at just to keep your debt constant into the future. Now, going back to some of the data, here's a slightly different representation of that same data you saw earlier, but this is now looking at the structural balance that you saw before, and then the primary balance, which is taking out the debt interest payments. Now, we're aiming for something that's between, say, plus 0.5%, plus 1.5% on average. In the past, countries on average across the OECD have only achieved that for quite a brief period during the early 1990s. It's essentially been negative. So the primary balance is a long way away from what it needs to be in order to reduce debt. So there's really only one conclusion you can draw from that, and that is, if we're going to have sustainable public debt, sustainable fiscal performance, we've either got to do something on the revenue side, or we've got to do something in the expenditure side in the future that's different from what we did in the past. Thank you. So here's some thoughts around revenue choices, and I stress these are kind of thoughts that they're not equations that are universally true. They're my suggestions of ways that we might think about how to tackle that problem. So on the revenue choice side, I would argue raising tax revenues by significant percentages of GDP in most OECD countries is not going to be straightforward, and it's going to be less straightforward, at least in the future, than it was in the past. And one reason is because tax revenue is, as I've said there, under threat, largely from increased mobility. So we know that taxation, if you're going to tax residents, one reason that governments often tax residents is that residents don't go anywhere. That was true in the 1950s and 60s. It's become less and less true. It was possibly less true, but nevertheless, broadly, economists thought it was true of investment in the 1950s and 60s. It's undoubtedly much less true today. So investment can pretty much move around the world in a globalized economy in a way that it didn't used to. And people, clearly, are doing that much more. And Australia and New Zealand, in particular, are two economies who understand that principle of labor mobility. So setting higher tax rates on factors that are mobile is very difficult because they simply move to avoid the higher taxes. Why would you live and work and base your company in Australia when you could do it in Hong Kong and face a 15% top marginal tax rate? So that's an issue that if we're going to try and raise more revenue to close that fiscal gap, it's going to become more difficult. Secondly, I think there's going to be more conflict as a result between what we might call efficient taxes and redistribution. Given time, I'm not going to say very much more about that at this stage, so let me move on. But one possible answer is to ask whether property taxes are a way to help out of this problem. Property taxes, by definition, tax something that isn't movable. And so in New Zealand, when I was in the Treasury, one of the things that we thought about, and indeed it was part of the advice that we gave Bill English when he was looking at his tax reform of 2010, was whether he should think about a relative move away from taxes that distort behavior like income taxes and towards property taxes. Perhaps not surprisingly, the political difficulties of implementing particular property tax in a very land-based economy like New Zealand wasn't something they found attractive. But it is a question that one has to ask. If you want to tax things that are based on residence, then don't tax things that move as soon as you tax them. But of course, the difficulty we're going to have is that in many cases, even if you succeed in raising revenue, ministers just love to have a fiscal surplus because it's an opportunity next year to spend more for all the reasons that ministers like to spend more. So how you stop politicians from spending these so-called sustainable fiscal surpluses that we'd like to try and achieve, I think is going to be difficult. And then briefly on the spending side, there are two aspects of public spending that we probably know we can do relatively little about, and that is demographics. Many OECD countries are experiencing demographic aging. We know Australia and New Zealand are. And the estimates we've had for a bunch of countries suggest that New Zealand's experience, and Australia's for that matter, is not that atypical. We're probably going to see, if we do nothing to affect entitlements to pensions and so on, we're probably going to see about a 4 percentage point increase in GDP on spending. That would be a mixture of higher pension payments because we've got more older people and higher health expenditures because older people generally incur more health expenditures. The relative price effect we saw already has been very important in the past. There's no reason to think that will change. And then lastly, there has been a lot of discussion. I guess most people in this room could hardly be unaware of the discussion about whether or not there's been a trend towards increased inequality in the last few years and whether that trend will continue. If it is likely to continue, that will create pressure for taxation to deliver and public expenditure to deliver better ways of overcoming the consequences of increased inequality. And so I guess the question I would raise with you is whether fiscal policy can be tasked to do that, or whether there might be better ways that we could try to achieve inclusiveness at the same time as we balance our fiscal books. I'm going to move on, because of time, on just two final slides. One is to say, is this relevant to New Zealand and Australia? I think it is. Although we've seen on the earlier data on debt that New Zealand and Australia have relatively low levels of public debt, it's clear that although that does give us an advantage and has given us an advantage after the GFC compared to a number of OECD countries, that there are quite a few things that can derail the New Zealand and Australian economies. We've already seen from Australia that the change in commodity prices has meant that a fiscal deficit can arise pretty quickly in an economy that otherwise looked to have survived the GFC quite well. It's also true that demographic and these relative price factors will still be true of New Zealand and Australia. And then lastly, one of the reasons we have low debt is precisely because as very small open economies, we are vulnerable to international investor sentiment. And as we saw in New Zealand in recent years, Standard & Poor's and other rating agencies, even with a 30% projected target for New Zealand's debt, was very concerned about its willingness, or the willingness of investors to invest in the New Zealand economy, or particularly to lend to governments. So not all countries can have the same high level of debt and get away with it. The USA appears to be one country for a variety of reasons that can sustain relatively high levels of debt, but much, much higher than we could expect in Australia and New Zealand. And then lastly, I guess most of you here, and as part of my experience, are in the public service or have been involved in the public service. I wanted to just say a word or two about the implications for policy advice in public service that arise from all of that. You can see the points that I'm making there. I think one thing that we can do as public servants is we need to grasp this nettle and be willing to try to persuade politicians and voters that there is a fiscal problem out there that must be dealt with. Persuading people to accept that the government will take more money from them than they'll spend on them is quite a difficult task to do. And I would argue that's one of the reasons that we're in the position that we're in now. Advisors, and particularly politicians, have not been willing to grasp that nettle over a long period of time. Second thing is, it was interesting to hear from Bill English earlier, pretty much saying similar sort of things here. I think our advice has got to be more innovative. If we want inclusive growth, if we want to encourage redistribution, then I think we need to find instruments that are consistent with the fiscal problem. And that might be less government spending and taxing, and thinking of other ways to deliver greater inequality. It might be greater use of NGOs. It might be, as Bill English pointed out, it might be greater spending in the short run in order to hopefully deal with the problem in a way that cuts spending in the future. And then I think it is going to involve smaller and more efficient public services. And I just raised the question of whether we often hear politicians who will beat the public service up for being inefficient. It just seems to be a convenient stick to beat the public service with. But I think regardless of how good our public service is, public administrations are going to have to be leaner and more efficient in order to not take resources away from the other things that governments want to do. And so just by way of conclusion, what do I think are the big questions coming out of fiscal policy? Well, I think they are whether voters will accept this notion that we're going to have spending bigger than taxation. I think the other big question is exactly how much inequality of after-tax and spending income voters are willing to accept. If it's the case that our globalized economy is worsening inclusiveness, then what's the level of inclusiveness that people want? And how do we respond to that with appropriate policy settings? And my third question is, are higher taxes feasible and acceptable in a more mobile, globalized economy? If voters can be persuaded to pay 40%, 50% on average of their income in tax, there isn't a problem. But if they can't be persuaded to do that, we have to think seriously about how we deal with that problem. Thank you.